I remember the day I first laid eyes on Glenwood Estates. The houses were pristine, rows of stately, two-story homes with manicured lawns and cheerful flower beds. A sense of quiet affluence settled over the sidewalks, every driveway sporting impeccably washed SUVs and sedans. Children biked down the cul-de-sacs, their laughter echoing through the maple-lined streets. It seemed, at first glance, like the very picture of suburban bliss. That was before I met Belinda, nicknamed Karen, behind her back, and the rest of the Glenwood Estates Homeowners Association. I was new to the community, having inherited my uncle's property just a few months earlier. He was something of a maverick, my Uncle Nick. He had built an unusual annex behind the house, a small railway spur that extended from a nearby industrial line. He'd used it to ship parts for a specialized manufacturing business he once ran. No one in Glenwood Estates had ever seen anything like it before. Frankly, I suspected it gave them a minor stroke just looking at it. Yet as bizarre and out of place as a tiny railway track might seem in a neighborhood of white picket fences, it was part of the property. I chose to keep it operational as a side business for small-scale freight transport. That alone was enough to give the neighbors something to gawk at. Still, there were plenty of folks who just shrugged and minded their own business. Then came the fateful day when I received my first official letter from the Glenwood Estates HOA. It was stuffed in my mailbox, typed in crisp black letters. The letter was from Belinda, though, around the neighborhood, people privately referred to her as Karen. She was the type of person who thrived on community regulation, or so she said. I'll never forget the opening line. Dear resident of 109, Maple Crescent, we regret to inform you that your property is in violation of Glenwood Estates guidelines. Nothing new. HOAs send out warnings about hedges an inch too tall or a fence that needs repainting. But I nearly choked on my coffee when I read the specific complaint. Operation of a private rail spur is in direct violation of Glenwood Estates guidelines, specifically Article 5, Section 12, Subsection C, regarding unauthorized industrial activities on residential lots. This was ridiculous on multiple levels. First, the business aspect was minimal. I didn't have a massive line of freight trains rolling through the neighborhood. Most of the shipping was done in small, specialized freight loads. Second, the rail spur was an inheritance, built long before the current HOA rules even existed. As far as I knew, my property was grandfathered in. After all, my uncle never had issues with them. Though, in fairness, he was quite intimidating in his prime and had little tolerance for pushy administrators. I decided to handle the matter with courtesy. I called the phone number on the letter, but no one answered. I tried emailing, only to receive an automated reply that repeated the same violation notice. So I drove down to the local HOA office. It was a modest building near the center of the subdivision. Inside was a neatly arranged waiting area, a few chairs, and a potted plant that looked strangely artificial. The walls were decorated with photos of Glenwood Estates from its early days, back when the region was farmland. I introduced myself to the receptionist, a young woman who seemed overwhelmed by a stack of paperwork. She was polite, but clearly exhausted. When I explained that I was the new owner of 109, Maple Crescent, her expression changed from polite confusion to a kind of resigned dread, as if she knew precisely who I was. She asked me to wait a moment, then disappeared into an office behind a frosted glass door. A few minutes later, the door swung open, and out walked a woman in her early 50s, wearing a pastel pink suit jacket over a white blouse. She carried a thick binder under her arm, and her hair was styled in a neat bob that looked impervious to wind. She fixed me with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes, which were a steely gray, and introduced herself. "Hello, I'm Belinda," she said, brandishing her hand as though I should be honored to shake it. Her handshake was surprisingly firm, nearly crushing my fingers. "I'm the president of the Glenwood Estates Homeowners Association." And thus began my introduction to the formidable Karen of Glenwood Estates. She wasted no time steering me into her office, which was organized to a fault, color-coded files, immaculate shelves, and an imposing wooden desk that looked like something an old judge would use. She motioned for me to sit, and then pulled out the violation notice from her binder. "Thank you for coming in. We've tried to contact you regarding a serious violation," she said, tapping the letter with a well-manicured nail. "The private rail spur on your property. It's not allowed." I tried to explain the situation, my uncle's legacy, The nature of the business, the grandfather clause. She listened, her gaze unwavering, lips pressed into a thin line. Then she shook her head. This matter has been brought to our attention only recently, she said curtly. It seems your uncle's usage flew under the radar, but it's no longer permissible under the association's policies. I'm afraid it's as simple as that. I didn't know whether to be outraged at her dismissive tone or stunned by the arrogance in her words. She was basically telling me that everything that existed before the HOA decided to update the rulebook didn't count. Under the radar? My uncle used the Spur for years, I said. And I don't believe the rule you're quoting even existed when he built it. Belinda, Karen, straightened her posture and gave me a patronizing smile. HOA guidelines are updated regularly to maintain the uniformity and safety of our community. The onus is on you, as the homeowner, to ensure compliance. Her tone was that of a school principal lecturing a wayward student. My frustration mounted. So what do you propose I do? I asked, trying to keep my temper in check. Rip out the tracks? Shut down the business? That's thousands of dollars in cost, not to mention the heritage I'm protecting. She leaned forward, steepling her hands. There are always options. We can negotiate a time frame for removal, or you can pay significant fines until you comply. However, in the interest of neighborhood harmony, it's best to address this quickly. Neighborhood harmony. That phrase hammered home the oppressive nature of the HOA. They were less concerned about fairness and more about forcing conformity. I realized then that my attempts at a polite resolution were likely doomed. Still, I decided to stay civil. I told Karen that I needed some time to consult with legal experts, especially regarding the grandfather clause. She nodded, her smile perfectly frozen in place. Certainly. You have 15 days from today to submit an official appeal. After that, the fines begin. I left the meeting feeling like I'd just had a run-in with a steamroller. So that was how the Glenwood Estates HOA operated, at least under Karen's rule, pushing, intimidating, and burying people in threats of fines. I went home, did some research, and discovered that the rail spur, while peculiar, had certain usage rights tied to my uncle's original arrangement with the railroad company. My property deed mentioned an easement for the spur, one that predates any HOA restrictions. I was ready to make a legal stand if necessary. Over the next week, letters kept arriving, reminders about the violation, reminders about the deadline, warnings about upcoming fines. I was bombarded with official HOA messages full of language that conveyed, in polite legalese, "We will ruin you if you don't do as we say." Meanwhile, I learned more about Karen from neighbors. Belinda Arkwright was a local real estate agent before she took over the HOA presidency. She was fiercely proud of Glenwood Estates' reputation and looked down upon anything she felt was unbefitting her vision. Rumor was, she took it upon herself to personally monitor the conditions of lawns, driveways, and even the paint colors on shutters. She had single-handedly quashed multiple homeowner projects for fear they might lower property values, which was her favorite phrase. One neighbor quietly told me about how Belinda forced them to remove a charming little fountain in their front yard. Another recounted her threat of legal action because a family stored their small fishing boat in their driveway. The story that struck me most was when she tried to regulate the color of someone's Christmas lights because they were too flashy. Even as I heard these stories, I continued to gather my own defenses, meeting with a lawyer friend of mine, Ross, who specialized in real estate law. He confirmed that, indeed, the rail spur could be protected by a grandfather clause if it was in continuous legal operation prior to the adoption of any new HOA rules. The catch, he said, was that the HOA might challenge whether it was in continuous use since it seemed my uncle's business had slowed down in the last few years of his life. If the HOA could argue that the usage had effectively been abandoned, they might have a legal angle to force me to dismantle it. This was the beginning of a legal and personal tug-of-war that would span months. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior grew bolder. She began sending neighbors, particularly older retirees who looked up to her as an authority, to knock on my door and ask about the noise from the spur or the potential hazards. At times, she herself would stand on the sidewalk, arms folded, glaring at the track that ran beside my garage. One Sunday morning, I was in the backyard, inspecting the rails, when I heard her voice from the fence line. She was talking to an older couple, gesturing wildly with her hands. Then she shouted over, "You do realize a derailment could happen at any time, yes? Imagine a train plowing straight into your neighbor's yard. Her tone was theatrical, designed to instill fear. I set my wrench down and approached the fence. That's nonsense, I called back calmly. It's a short spur. The trains that come through are small-scale freight engines, traveling at a crawl. There's no threat. Karen's eyes narrowed. Even small trains can cause massive damage. Besides, the question is why you have an industrial operation in a residential area at all. It's unacceptable. She marched away, leaving the elderly couple looking startled by her outburst. I realized then just how determined she was to stir up fear and turn the neighborhood against me. A wave of bitterness washed over me. This was all so unnecessary. If she'd simply had a civil conversation, we might have found a compromise. But Karen thrived on conflict, on controlling others. The tension escalated when I received a letter not just from the HOA, but also from a local code enforcement officer. The officer, presumably prodded by Karen, cited me for improper industrial usage in a residential zone. This was more serious than a mere HOA violation. It could lead to heavy municipal fines or even a forced shutdown. However, the city code had a detail that might still protect me. My property was on the border of a small industrial zone expansion established decades ago when the railway lines were put in. Because my uncle's place had direct rail access, the property was partially zoned for light industrial use, albeit in a strange overlay that also recognized its residential status. It was complicated, but it gave me a legal argument. Throughout these clashes, I began to contemplate an alternative plan. If the HOA was so set on shutting down my rail spur, maybe there was a way to beat them at their own game. I started researching who actually owned the crossing that connected my spur to the main line. It turned out that the crossing was on a strip of land that had been sold off decades ago by the original farmland owners to the county. Later, the county put the crossing rights up for sale to the highest bidder. In most places, these things stay under the control of the railroad or local government. But as luck, or irony, would have it, the county was open to selling certain parcels of land containing crossing easements as a cost-saving measure to reduce liability. My mind began to spin with possibilities. If I owned the crossing itself, I could theoretically close it off, thereby controlling access in or out of the neighborhood, assuming it was the only crossing. I needed to find out more about the local geography. One night, I combed through old property records, topographic maps, and zoning documents. I discovered that the crossing near my property was indeed the primary rail crossing for the entire area. The main freight line intersected the neighborhood's single arterial route near the southwestern boundary. The local roads had been built around it in such a way that if I decided to block or limit the crossing, it would severely impact not just the rail activity, but also the neighborhood's access to certain utility paths that used the rail corridor. It was a drastic move, to say the least. But Karen had shown no intention of backing down, and I was already spending thousands in legal fees defending my right to keep the spur. So I thought, why not go on the offensive? I contacted a realtor who specialized in unique land transactions. He helped me confirm that the crossing was indeed up for sale. The county had it listed quietly, not actively marketing it, but they were open to offers. The purchase price wasn't cheap, but it was nowhere near what one might expect for a piece of essential infrastructure, probably because nobody had thought to buy it. Most folks assume these things are never sold or are perpetually owned by the government or railroad. I played my cards close to the chest, not revealing my plan even to my lawyer. I didn't want word getting back to Karen or the HOA that I was about to secure a piece of land that gave me leverage. I scheduled a private negotiation with the county officials, who were somewhat puzzled by my interest but happy to receive a serious buyer. After weeks of back-and-forth haggling, I managed to get the contract signed. It was official. I owned the crossing that connected Glenwood Estates to the main rail line. I had to pinch myself when I received the title documents. My lawyer, Ross, nearly fell out of his chair when I finally told him. "You bought the crossing?" he asked, stunned. "Why?" I explained my reasoning. If the HOA was determined to shut down my spur and cost me my business, I'd simply respond by shutting down the crossing. Then, if they truly wanted to go toe-to-toe, they'd discover how complicated it would be to challenge a private citizen's legitimate ownership of infrastructure. The situation wasn't as simple as just closing a road. This was railroad property with easements. But I could at least hamper the HOA's ability to use the rail crossing for anything, or I could claim maintenance rights that allowed me to block or limit usage during repairs. That's one hell of a revenge move, Ross said, eyebrows raised. But be careful. This could escalate. I nodded, fully aware of the potential for blowback. But I was tired of playing defense. The day after my purchase went through, I sent a polite yet pointed email to the HOA board, addressed, of course, to Karen, informing them of a legal development that would affect the rail corridor near Glenwood Estates. I didn't go into detail, but I hinted that they should reconsider their stance on shutting down my Spur. Karen's response was swift and dripping with passive-aggressive condescension. Dear homeowner at 109 Maple Crescent, we appreciate any efforts to work in good faith with the HOA. However, the matter of your violation remains. The Glenwood Estates HOA is prepared to proceed with fines and potential legal action if the rail spur is not dismantled in accordance with our guidelines. Sincerely, Belinda A., President, Glenwood Estates HOA. I smiled grimly. She had no idea what I'd done. 2 days later, I filed the appropriate paperwork to request a closure of the crossing for maintenance and assessment. According to the regulations, as the crossing owner, I had the right to temporarily halt traffic, rail or otherwise, on that crossing to perform safety checks, repairs, or improvements. Typically, crossing owners do this in cooperation with local authorities to minimize disruptions. But in my case, I made it clear that the crossing would be closed indefinitely until further notice, citing urgent structural concerns. I included an engineering report from a friend who performed a cursory inspection, pointing out minor cracks in the asphalt near the rails that could pose a hazard if left unaddressed. Almost immediately, the closure caused havoc. Freight trains that used that line to service a warehouse on the other side of the neighborhood had to be rerouted or halted. The local public works department started receiving calls, questioning why the crossing was closed and if it was a municipal decision. That's when the city realized that, no, it wasn't their crossing anymore. It belonged to me now. So the calls came to me. I explained that I was happy to reopen it once the repairs were completed, repairs that might take an indefinite amount of time, subject to thorough reviews, and so on. Within days, I saw panic setting in among certain community members. Truck deliveries for local businesses were affected. Some folks who liked to take the scenic route near the tracks discovered it was blocked. Admittedly, it was an inconvenience for many. But my message was clear. If the HOA wanted to play the property rights game, two could play at that. Finally, I received a phone call from Karen herself. She tried to keep her composure, but I could hear the tension in her voice. You're creating a disturbance in the community, and it's unacceptable, she snapped. You need to reopen that crossing immediately. I leaned back in my chair, letting a moment of silence stretch out before responding. I'm terribly sorry, I said, feigning concern. But the crossing has significant maintenance issues. I'd hate to be liable for any accidents if trains were allowed through. I'm sure you understand. Her voice quavered with barely contained fury. No one's heard of such a thing. How did you even come to own it? I shrugged, though she couldn't see it. It was on the market. I had the means. The county sold it to me. It's perfectly legal. She let out a harsh laugh of disbelief. Do you realize the chaos this is causing? The entire neighborhood is blaming the HOA now. I suppressed a smile. Oh, that's unfortunate. But you, as the HOA, were the ones pushing to shut down my private rail spur. I believe that was also causing me chaos, not to mention potential financial ruin. There was a beat of silence before she roared. This is different. The HOA is responsible for maintaining property values and the quality of life for all residents. You can't just sabotage everyone. I kept my voice calm, like a teacher explaining something to a hostile student. I'm not sabotaging anyone. I'm merely exercising my legal rights to ensure the crossing is safe. If the HOA is willing to reconsider their stance on my spur and rescind the violation, perhaps we can reach an agreement. Otherwise, I'm afraid it may take some time before I can reopen it. She hung up without another word. Over the next few days, I received a flurry of emails and letters from the HOA, from local businesses, and even from some city officials. Some were polite inquiries, others were outright threats. Karen, apparently, tried to rally the neighborhood into a legal campaign against me. But each time, I reiterated that I was simply ensuring public safety. If they wanted it reopened sooner, they could cover the repair costs, sign legal waivers, and, of course, drop all actions against my spur. While this strategy certainly painted me as a villain in some eyes, I had no interest in actually harming the local economy or inconveniencing neighbors who had done me no wrong. I just needed to show the HOA, especially Karen, that they couldn't bully me with impunity. Eventually, a city mediator stepped in, urging both sides to come to a compromise. By then, Karen was backed into a corner. She risked a revolt among residents who blamed her for provoking me. Under pressure, she finally agreed to revoke the violation notice against my rail spur. In exchange, I agreed to expedite the crossing repairs. Of course, that wasn't the end of my troubles with Karen. She was humiliated and vengeful. Over the following months, she launched smaller, more insidious attacks, anonymous complaints about my property's landscaping, rumors that I was violating local noise ordinances, and even personal jabs about how someone with a rail yard in their backyard must be an eccentric hoarder. But these attempts lacked the official weight of the HOA board, since most members wanted nothing more to do with her crusade after the crossing debacle. I was largely able to ignore her pettiness. Things took a dramatic turn when I discovered Karen was actually meddling in my business dealings. I received a phone call from one of my suppliers who said he got an odd message warning him that shipping materials to my spur might be illegal. The caller claimed to be from the local city council, but didn't leave a name. Suspicious, I reached out to a friend on the city council. They confirmed that no one from the council had made any such calls. That's when I realized Karen had likely impersonated a city official to scare my suppliers, hoping to pressure me into shutting down the spur through lost business. This was a bridge too far. Impersonating a government official is a serious offense. I gathered evidence, phone logs, emails, and statements from my supplier, and approached local law enforcement. The detective I spoke with recognized my story from the crossing fiasco that had caused a stir in the community a while back. He seemed intrigued by the possibility that someone was waging a personal vendetta through fraudulent means. A formal investigation was opened, and in time, it led straight to Karen's door. When the detective confronted her, she tried to bluster her way out of it, claiming ignorance. But the evidence was too strong. Her call records matched the exact times and dates of the threatening calls. She had used a spoofed number, but digital footprints are hard to erase for an amateur. The revelation shocked the HOA board, who quickly distanced themselves from her. Publicly, they apologized and emphasized that Karen's actions were her own, not sanctioned by the association. They even held an emergency meeting where members voted to remove her from the presidency. Karen, of course, claimed it was all a misunderstanding, but no one believed her. The legal proceedings moved forward, and she was charged with impersonating a public official and harassment. She was given bail, pending a court appearance. But Karen had one more card to play. She filed a civil lawsuit against me, claiming I had slandered her reputation by telling people she was a bully and had manipulated HOA rules. Her suit was as weak as it was predictable. With my lawyer's help, I had no trouble dismantling her claims in court. In fact, it backfired on her when the judge saw through her ploy. The same judge also presided over her criminal case, and it appeared her frivolous lawsuit only solidified the image of someone who believed she was above the law. The day of her sentencing came like a thunderclap. I was present in the courtroom, partly out of curiosity, partly to ensure closure for the turmoil she had unleashed. The judge recounted all the ways Karen had abused her position and defied both the spirit of the law and the well-being of the community. When the gavel finally struck, Karen was handed a severe sentence that included prison time, something rarely doled out for such crimes. But in her case, the judge felt it was warranted given her repeated attempts to manipulate or obstruct justice. Furthermore, her personal assets were partly seized to pay restitution to those she had harmed, including me. That was how Karen's reign in Glenwood Estates came to a definitive end. The once fearsome HOA president, who had lorded over the neighborhood with an iron fist, found herself stripped of her title, her property, and her freedom. The final image I have of her is the stunned look on her face as she realized her illusions of invincibility were shattered. In the aftermath, the HOA board underwent a massive reorganization, implementing better checks and balances to prevent any single individual from wielding disproportionate power. Many residents, once intimidated by Karen, breathed a sigh of relief. A few even expressed gratitude that I had stood up to her. My private rail spur remains intact, and ironically, The crossing that I had purchased now functions smoothly after the thorough repairs. I continue to operate my small freight shipping service without any interference, having proven that I had every right to do so. Looking back, I sometimes marvel at how a simple, inherited rail spur could trigger such a storm of conflict. But in a place like Glenwood Estates, where uniformity, conformity, and property values were the driving mantras, anything unusual was bound to draw attention. Karen's obsession with control propelled a neighborhood dispute into a full-blown legal battle. In the end, she lost everything by overplaying her hand, showcasing what happens when arrogance meets unyielding resolve. For my part, I learned the importance of knowing one's rights and not bowing to intimidation. And I take a certain satisfaction in knowing that the next time some overzealous HOA tries to bully a homeowner, they might think twice, remembering how quickly the scales can tip when you decide to fight back. In the weeks following Karen's sentencing, Glenwood Estates underwent a transformation that was as symbolic as it was overdue. With Karen gone, a new sense of openness and neighborly cooperation flourished. The board held town hall meetings instead of closed-door sessions. People attended in record numbers, and while disagreements still arose over lawn decorations, paint colors, and other typical suburban matters, the atmosphere was one of respectful debate rather than authoritarian decree. I found myself tentatively welcomed by residents who had once viewed me with suspicion. My victory over the overbearing HOA, and especially over Karen, had earned me a kind of reluctant admiration. Of course, not everyone liked the way I'd closed the rail crossing to force the HOA's hand. Some folks considered it too extreme. But they grudgingly acknowledged that my actions had exposed a deeper rot within the association's leadership. Free from Karen's intimidation, the new board allowed me to present the history and function of the rail spur at a community gathering. I explained the industrial origins of the region, how the track had been installed decades before Glenwood Estates was even built, and how my uncle's niche freight business had benefited the local economy in small but significant ways. Photos of my uncle and a few historical tidbits about how the rails once connected to a distant copper mine fascinated more residents than I expected. By the end of the evening, a surprising number of neighbors came up to express their support for preserving the spur as a historical landmark, a possibility I hadn't seriously considered. One neighbor, a middle-aged man named Tom who lived down the street, became something of a friend. He had quietly cheered me on during my battle with Karen, but had stayed on the sidelines for fear of backlash. Now that things had calmed down, he invited me over for a barbecue. Over steaks and corn on the cob, he shared stories of how Karen had once threatened him with fines because he erected a small greenhouse in his backyard for his wife's gardening hobby. She claimed the reflective panels on the greenhouse windows could bother the neighbors. Tom had torn it down in frustration, but he never forgot the sting of her overreach. Others had similar stories. A retired teacher, Ms. Dawson, admitted she'd wanted to fight back when Karen forced her to remove a birdbath, but she couldn't afford the legal costs. Then there was a family who'd been threatened over their wheelchair ramp, which Karen deemed unsightly. Thankfully, that threat never materialized, likely because the Americans with Disabilities Act provided legal protection. As these tales circulated, Karen's reputation deteriorated from fearsome dictator to cautionary tale. People shook their heads at how one person's quest for control had sown so much misery. More tellingly, the residents who had always been content to follow the rules realized how easily those rules could be weaponized against them, especially when one person held too much sway. As for Karen, the fallout from her legal troubles extended beyond her jail sentence. When investigators dug deeper into her finances, they discovered irregularities in how she'd handled HOA funds. Small sums had vanished under questionable invoices, and while the amounts weren't massive, they compounded the case against her for financial misconduct. The local media picked up the story, turning Karen into a local pariah. Neighbors who once feared her or kept quiet now felt emboldened to criticize and distance themselves. The punishment the court meted out became more severe as the case expanded. Not only did she face time behind bars, but her assets, including her immaculately kept house, were frozen pending restitution. A lien was placed on her property to help repay the financial losses to the HOA. Rumor had it that the bank eventually foreclosed on the house when Karen defaulted on her mortgage payments. People whispered about the irony. The The queen of the manicured lawns lost her own house to legal and financial ruin. I also learned that Karen's husband, a rather aloof man named Peter, had quietly filed for divorce before the sentencing. Perhaps he wanted to protect himself or separate his finances from her looming debts. Whatever the reason, it struck me as the final severance of Karen's ties to Glenwood Estates. She had no champion, no defenders left in the neighborhood she once lorded over. Meanwhile, I continued to address the crossing's status. Owning it came with responsibilities. I had to ensure its structural integrity and coordinate with local authorities whenever rail traffic needed to pass. Now that the dispute with the HOA was resolved, I reopened it for normal use, subject to standard safety protocols. The city sent engineers to confirm the repairs, and we established a more formal agreement. In the event of future maintenance needs, I'd coordinate with them in advance. The friction that had once fueled the fiasco had cooled to a manageable routine. My rail spur business, though modest, picked up slightly. Perhaps the story's notoriety piqued the interest of new clients. I started receiving inquiries from specialty manufacturers needing small freight shipments. Some neighbors, curious about the rail operations, asked for tours. I obliged them, turning a potential point of contention into an educational showcase. Kids loved seeing the tracks up close, and the older generation enjoyed swapping stories about the region's industrial past. With Karen's downfall, the dynamic of Glenwood Estates shifted in countless small but meaningful ways. The board members who replaced her spearheaded reforms. They revised the covenant guidelines to be less restrictive, introduced new processes that required community votes for major changes, and mandated transparency in financial matters. No longer could a single president dictate punishments or selectively enforce rules. The sense of collective relief was palpable. During this time, I gained a new appreciation for the resilience and adaptability of communities. People who once seemed passive became actively involved in shaping the neighborhood's future. Even those who had aligned with Karen out of fear or ignorance began to voice their opinions freely. As time passed, the memory of Karen's tyranny faded into a cautionary footnote, a reminder of how unchecked authority can poison even the most idyllic suburban enclaves. But I still had unresolved emotions. A part of me felt satisfaction at seeing Karen held accountable for her actions, but another part felt uneasy. The punishment was undeniably severe. She had been cruel, manipulative, and illegal in her tactics, and she deserved to face consequences. Yet seeing someone lose everything, even someone who had caused so much harm, could stir conflicting emotions. I wrestled with the question of whether I, in my quest to protect my rights, had pushed too far. Had there been a more peaceful resolution? My conscience found some solace in the fact that Karen's downfall was largely self-inflicted. She had chosen to impersonate officials, falsify records, and siphon HOA funds. Even if I had tried to reason with her, her arrogance likely would have led her down a destructive path sooner or later. Perhaps the only difference was that my defiance sped up the timetable. Life settled into a new normal. Every so often, I'd pass by the vacant lot that used to be Karen's meticulously landscaped lawn. Weeds sprouted through cracks in the driveway, and the once pristine shrubs grew wild. The contrast was jarring. I couldn't help but think, this is what remains of her empire. A silent testament to how quickly power can vanish when misused. In an odd twist, a local historical society took interest in my rail spur after hearing about the infamous HOA versus rail spur saga. A couple of members visited my property, delighted to see a piece of living history. One of them, an elderly gentleman named Franklin, recalled that as a young man, he'd worked on the very line that connected to my spur. His eyes shone with nostalgia as he ran his hand along the steel rails, telling me how he once operated a switch engine on these tracks. Inspired by Franklin's passion, the Historical Society proposed a small plaque to commemorate the unique heritage of the spur. They offered to help with the cost and organization of a dedication ceremony. At first, I hesitated, still somewhat uneasy about drawing further attention. But after reflecting on how this piece of track had shaped not just my life, but the history of the area, I agreed. The ceremony was a modest affair. Maybe 50 people showed up, mostly older folks and a few curious younger families. The society unveiled a simple metal plaque near the mouth of the spur. In honor of Glenwood's industrial roots, the maple spur, established in the early 20th century, preserved through the generations. A local news reporter came to cover the event, linking the plaque's installation to the now famous story of how an HOA tried, and failed, to bury a piece of local history. He asked me for an interview, and I obliged. As the camera rolled, I spoke about my uncle's passion, the significance of preserving what came before, and the importance of standing up for one's rights against overreach. There was no mention of Karen by name, though everyone in Glenwood Estates undoubtedly knew the story. I preferred to keep the focus on the positive outcome, a stronger community, and a preserved piece of heritage. Months stretched into a year, and chatter of Karen's name diminished. People moved on with their lives. Some left Glenwood Estates for work or family reasons. New families moved in, and the cycle of suburban life continued. The new HOA leadership remained cautious, mindful of not repeating Karen's errors. They collaborated with homeowners rather than dictating terms, and the tension that once clouded the neighborhood receded. Then, out of the blue, I received an email from a journalist working on a feature about neighborhood associations gone wrong. He had uncovered Karen's case during his research and wanted my first-hand perspective. I consented to an interview, under the condition that I didn't want to sensationalize the matter or come across as a vindictive winner. The journalist, a thoughtful man named Daniel, asked probing questions about the legal intricacies, the personal toll, and how it felt to stand up to an entire HOA. When he asked about Karen's personal fate, I offered a measured response. I believe she reaped the consequences of her own actions. It's unfortunate how things turned out, but perhaps there's a lesson in accountability for everyone. The feature was published online, generating a wave of discussion. Comments flooded in from readers who had faced similar issues with their HOAs. Some praised me for fighting back. Others debated the morality of leveraging property ownership to force compliance. It underscored how polarized the subject of HOAs could be. One commenter wrote, "This is exactly why I'll never live in an HOA. One bad apple can ruin your life if you don't have the resources to fight." Another remarked, "Finally, someone who didn't back down. Good for you." In a quiet moment, I reflected on how far I'd come since the day I found that first HOA violation letter in my mailbox. Back then, I was naive to the powerful undercurrent of fear and control that can exist in such communities. I only wanted to preserve my uncle's legacy and run a small freight operation. Instead, I ended up buying a rail crossing, tangling with city officials, and ultimately setting in motion a chain of events that brought down an HOA president. Despite the drama, I still cherished the sense of community that Glenwood Estates had the potential to offer. I had grown up in a more urban setting where neighbors rarely greeted each other. Here, at least, there was a semblance of collective identity, which could be positive if guided by fair-minded people. The new leadership showed me that an HOA could be a force for maintaining the neighborhood's appeal without trampling on individual rights. One day, a small group of children from the local elementary school, accompanied by a teacher, visited the Spur as part of a field trip on local history. I watched them bounce around excitedly, pointing at the rails, asking if trains still came through. I explained that small freight engines occasionally passed, and their eyes lit up with the kind of wonder only kids display. Seeing their enthusiasm reminded me of my own childhood excitement whenever I encountered trains. It was a good reminder that behind all the legal battles and grown-up squabbles, sometimes it's these simpler joys that matter the most. In the end, Karen remained in prison, serving her sentence for financial misconduct, impersonation, and harassment. Occasionally, I would read a brief update about her appeals being denied or another hearing that went nowhere. She no longer held power over anyone, and Glenwood Estates no longer trembled at her name. Her property was sold at auction, the new owner renovating the neglected house and yard. Life, as always, moved on. One afternoon, I received a letter from an unfamiliar return address. Inside was a short note, written in a shaky hand. It was from Karen. She had managed to send it from prison. I stood in my kitchen, reading her words. "I'm sure you relish your victory. I've lost nearly everything. But one day, people like you will learn that you can't defy the greater good. My fight was never just about my ego, despite what everyone thinks. I truly believed in order, in preserving a clean and proper community. Enjoy your rail spur while you can. It won't last forever. Things change, and you'll see the world is better off with strict rules. If you have a shred of decency, perhaps you'll admit it was never personal, just business." B. Her words brought back a rush of memories. The anger, the frustration, the sense of being smothered by petty authority. Yet now, they carried no threat. She was a toothless lion, lashing out from a cage. I found myself feeling neither anger nor triumph, just pity. I contemplated writing back, but decided there was nothing productive to say. She was stuck in her worldview, convinced that her draconian approach was justified. No letter from me would change that. Months passed, and I forgot about the note. My focus shifted to improving the property, building stronger friendships with my neighbors, and expanding my side business. Glenwood Estates continued to evolve in a healthier direction, thanks to the lessons learned from the Karen era. One day, Tom, my neighbor with the greenhouse story, brought up the possibility of reintroducing a community garden project. He'd once suggested it to the HOA, but was shot down by Karen, who claimed it would be too messy and attract pests. Now, with a more open-minded board, the idea garnered support. I even offered a small portion of the land behind my house as a test plot. To my surprise, the board voted to fund raised garden beds, seeds, and a compost system. Residents came out to help, and the project became a symbol of the new cooperative spirit in Glenwood Estates. On the day we planted the first seedlings, neighbors mingled cheerfully, sharing gardening tips and stories about their families. Standing there in the warmth of the sun, trowel in hand, I couldn't help but reflect on the stark contrast between now and the days when Karen's oppressive shadow loomed over every discussion. The laughter of neighbors, the communal effort to grow something together. It reaffirmed my belief that communities are built on mutual respect and shared goals, not on fear and rigid enforcement. It also struck me as a bit poetic that plants would take root where once an authoritarian approach had threatened to uproot so many individuals' dreams. The blossoming garden served as an apt metaphor for what a neighborhood can become when nurtured by dialogue and mutual understanding. This was the final chapter in Glenwood Estates' transformation, a chapter that might never have been written had Karen remained in power. And so the story of how I fought the HOA and won, effectively dethroning its queen, ended with something as humble and hopeful as seeds growing in a community garden. The private rail spur continued to operate, trains occasionally rumbling through to pick up or deliver freight. The crossing I owned had been fully integrated into a new civic agreement, ensuring transparency and fairness in its operation. Life carried on, but with an undercurrent of shared respect that had been missing before. On quiet mornings, I still look out at the railway tracks, remembering my uncle's relentless spirit. I think of how proud he would be to know his rail spur wasn't just a relic of the past, but a symbol of standing up for what's right. I also think of Karen, perhaps stewing in resentment, still convinced that her downfall was due to other people's failings rather than her own. But that's no longer my burden to bear. In the end, Glenwood Estates proved that even in the face of authoritarian overreach, a community can heal and emerge stronger. Karen's downfall was dramatic and absolute, a stark warning to anyone who might try to wield HOA power as a personal cudgel. But more importantly, it underscored the resilience of ordinary people who refuse to let their rights be trampled. Whenever I hear the distant whistle of a train on the main line, I can't help but smile. Sometimes, the greatest victories are the ones that preserve what we cherish most: freedom, heritage, and the simple dignity of living on one's own terms. In that sense, my final revenge on Karen isn't just her imprisonment or the seizure of her property. It's the knowledge that despite all her efforts, she couldn't extinguish the spirit of independence and cooperation that took root in Glenwood Estates. And that, I think, is a legacy worth defending.